The Life and Legacy of Laura Ingalls Wilder, Literal and Literature Frontiers. Laura Ingalls Wilder grew to fame by writing a series of children's books, loosely based on her childhood on the American frontier. Crossing literal frontiers moving west, she broke literature frontiers through her novels, greatly influencing society's view of the United States' 19th century. Laura Ingalls Wilder was born to Charles and Caroline Ingalls on February 7, 1867, in Pepin County, Wisconsin. Her older sister, Mary, was born in 1865 in Pepin County. Due to Charles's adventuresome spirit, he frequently moved himself and his family during the United States era of westward expansion. The growing Ingalls family continually pushed through the frontiers of the American West. In 1868, Charles sold their Wisconsin farm, shared with Caroline's brother, and they moved to Montgomery County, Kansas, also known as Indian Territory, where Carrie Ingalls was born in 1870. After a brief return to Pepin, Wisconsin, they settled along Plum Creek in Walnut Grove, Minnesota. Tragedy struck the Ingalls family when they lost son Charles Ingalls as a newborn due to illness, a situation none of them ever mentioned again. They spent a brief period of time in Burr Creek, Iowa to run a hotel business, where Grace Ingalls was born in 1877, completing their family. Charles moved the family back to Walnut Grove after crop failures and a grasshopper plague. In 1879, when Laura was 12, the Ingalls family moved to De Smet, South Dakota, then known as the Dakota Territory, where Laura spent the rest of her childhood divided between their homestead and living in town. These years were primarily marked by Mary's illness that caused her to lose her sight, giving Laura the additional responsibility of being her eyes. As a whole, frontier life was incredibly difficult for Laura and her family. Living in poverty for most of her childhood, due to both tough farming and economic conditions, such as the infamous long winter of 1880 to 1881, the Ingalls family truly had to fight for survival. During the relative stability of the De Smet years, Caroline was incredibly excited for her children to receive a formal education, even though Charles and Laura constantly yearned for homesteading life. Despite never completing high school, Laura had a strong passion for learning. In 1884, at the age of 15, she got her teaching certificate to support her family and save money to send Mary to the Iowa College for the Blind.
There's that remarkable scene with Mr. Owen, which occurs in both Pioneer Girl and later in the Little House books themselves, where Mr. Owen compliments the young Laura on her first exposition, her first writing assignment. What I think is remarkable about that is not only that Laura Ingalls Wilder wrote about the scene both in Pioneer Girl and later in the Little House books, but that she kept the original writing assignment from Mr. Owen for all of those years. She still has that, and she kept all of her scraps of poetry. For me, that indicates that Laura Ingalls Wilder probably had the ambition to write very early on.
Overly homesick, teaching in an unfamiliar region 12 miles from her loved ones, Laura became friends with Almanzo Wilder. Almanzo was a hero of De Smet, as he saved their town during a blizzard by driving 40 miles for wheat. He began bringing her home by buggy every weekend from her teaching position, and they later began a courtship. Laura was happy to get married to Almanzo in 1885 and begin their new life together. By 1886, they had their first child, Rose Wilder, while still living relatively close to Laura's family. They then started to frequently move on the frontier, similarly to Laura's childhood. Unfortunately, their first few years as a married couple were filled with hardships, starting with losing their wheat crop and barn. Almanzo and Laura then lost their baby boy in 1889, and their home burnt to the ground soon after while living in Dakota Territory. Laura and Almanzo contracted diphtheria during these difficult times. While Laura made a full recovery, Almanzo was left partially paralyzed and with poor health/mobility for the rest of his life, which greatly impacted their farming livelihood. After spending some time living in Florida in a fruitless attempt to improve Almanzo's health, and later living with Wilder family in Minnesota, Laura, Almanzo, and Rose settled down for the final time in Missouri in 1894. They paid $100 to purchase 40 acres to begin their Rocky Ridge farm, where they had great financial success and stayed for the rest of their lives. The Wilder family quickly settled into Missouri life. Rose grew up and began her own writing career. Both Almanzo and Laura became well known locally for their farming skills. Laura started writing for various periodicals such as McCall's Magazine and Country Gentleman primarily because of Rose's encouragement. For 12 years, Laura was the home editor for the Missouri Ruralist, where she wrote about her tips and experiences with farming, especially regarding chickens. As Laura became more experienced with writing, Rose encouraged her to write down her childhood stories. During this time, she wrote the autobiography Pioneer Girl. The publishers who viewed her work encouraged her to rewrite her book in the form of children's fiction. Particularly due to the Great Depression, Rose told Laura that audiences would be more receptive to hearing a positive, heartwarming spin on her childhood rather than the brutal truth of frontier life. Laura heeded their advice and began the Little House on the Prairie series, focusing on a fictionalized version of her childhood while the core values of the pioneer spirit and American independence were still present. These books crucially left out violent aspects of frontier life they felt were unsuitable for young children. Little House in the Big Woods, based on Laura's childhood in Wisconsin, was published in 1932 to great success. The series followed with Farmer Boy, 1933, based on Almanzo's childhood in New York, Little House on the Prairie, 1935, based on Laura's time in Kansas, also known as Indian Territory, On the Banks of Plum Creek, 1937, based on Laura's time in Minnesota, and By the Shores of Silver Lake, 1939, The Long Winter, 1940, Little Town on the Prairie, 1941, and These Happy Golden Years, 1943, based on her adolescence in Dakota Territory. This series quickly broke many frontiers in the literary industry, with over 60 million copies sold, now in over 26 languages. Laura quickly became a household name, especially because her books were published during the beginning of children's novels as a literary genre, and they quickly became a staple. She greatly enjoyed sending letters to her young fans, which provided a view into her kind and giving nature. After a fan apologized for addressing an earlier letter as Dear Laura, fearing it was too informal, she replied with, Certainly you may call me Laura. I am glad you feel like doing so. Unfortunately, Almanzo died on October 23, 1949 in Mansfield, Missouri at Rocky Ridge Farm after a heart attack, devastating Laura and the rest of their family. Laura lived out the rest of her days interacting with her fans and spending time with her loved ones, keen to experience the new technologies and experiences the world had to offer. She passed away in her sleep on February 10, 1957 in Mansfield, Missouri at Rocky Ridge Farm. Laura's books continued to grow in popularity long after her death and are a staple of children's historical fiction many years later. Laura's manuscript about her tough initial years of married life was published in 1971 as the first 4 years. From 1974 to 1983, producer Ed Friendly and actor/executive producer Michael Landon created the Little House on the Prairie television show, adapted from Laura's novels. The series was a cultural sensation of the era and introduced her work to a larger audience, despite vast numbers of historical inaccuracies. Despite the relative success of Laura's work, controversies arose due to negative portrayals of people of color, and particularly Native Americans who already lived on the frontier. Quotes such as, There were no people, only Indians lived there, along with Caroline and Mary's exaggerated fear of Native Americans, portrayed them as both inhumane and dangerous. As a result, in June 2018, the American Library Association voted unanimously to change the prestigious literary award, previously known as the Laura Ingalls Wilder Award, to the Children's Literature Legacy Award. Many people, particularly Native Americans, were quite thrilled as they advocated against her work due to her many negative comments regarding their presence on the frontier.
They're saying, listen, we're not arguing that she shouldn't be read. We're not arguing that her books should be removed from libraries. They are sort of making a distinction in saying we think there's a difference between saying yes, this person is part of our historical literature and should be read versus saying that there should be an award given in this person's name.
Despite her negative portrayals of Native Americans and people of color on the frontier, Laura's books undeniably had a major impact on the way American society views the era of westward expansion. Teaching her books in their historical context can springboard discussion, along with showing children the importance of inclusivity in both daily life and the literary space. As you read my stories of long ago, I hope you'll remember that things truly worthwhile and that will give you happiness are the same now as they were then. It is not the things you have that make you happy. It is love and kindness and helping each other and just plain being good. Laura Ingalls Wilder.